Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Prairie Vegetable Gardening, how to grow prairie vegetables as a beginner. My name is Jackie Bantle. I work at the University of Saskatchewan, and I've grown vegetables for, well, I hate to admit, at least over 30 years at my workplace, and I have my own vegetable garden. So I'm here today to tell you how to get started in the vegetable garden. So if you've never gardened or you're not very experienced with growing vegetables, this is the talk for you. So I am going to go through 10 different vegetables that I consider pretty easy to grow, and you should be able to grow them without too much problem. And I'll point out some pointers as we go through the talk. So thanks for tuning in. Okay, so first off, you have to remember that in Saskatchewan, although we have really warm summers, it's a relatively short growing season. And so our last frost is usually around the 3rd or 4th week in May, and then we usually don't have a frost until into September. So we get about almost 120 frost-free days. So we can have late spring frosts or early fall frosts, and you have to be prepared for that. So when you are out there and picking plants, typically, like I said, we have 120 days, but you really want to grow a vegetable that is recommended for 75 days or less. And that has to do with our night temperatures, which are quite cool. So if you're ever looking in a seed catalog or online and you see a tomato that says, will mature in 90 days, and you're like, well, we have 120 days. That for sure will grow here. Well, no, that's not quite right, because I don't know where they're basing this on, but the 90 days are in a much warmer area than Saskatchewan. So like I said, grow vegetables that will ripen in 75 days or less. So at this point, hopefully you've been thinking about gardening, and if you haven't purchased your seed yet, you better get out there and do that now, because there's so many gardeners out there. Last year, people actually sold out of seed. I think it was a first in my lifetime. And so there's always a hot demand for seed. I think the seed companies will be a little more prepared this year, but you should definitely be thinking out going and getting your vegetable seed now. So you can go to your local garden center or your local greenhouse, check out the seed there. You can even go online and look for different Canadian seed sources. And I recommend Vessi Seeds out in PEI, or Stoke Seeds in Ontario, or West Coast Seeds in BC. And it's good to go to a Canadian source just because they know our climate and they're prepared for that. If you're ordering seed from Florida, they might say, oh yeah, this is an early variety. Yeah, for Florida, not for here. And also take a look at your local garden centers, because we should support our local people and see what they have to offer, and ask for advice at your local garden center. They will have first-hand advice on what will do well here. So when you're considering what am I going to grow, well, I'm going to go through 10 vegetables today that like I said, I think are easy to grow. But you should also think about, what do I like to eat? Today I might, tell you, well, radishes are easy to grow, but you hate the taste of radishes. Well, then don't bother growing them. Just, don't worry about that. The other thing you have to think about is, how much space do you have? How much, what size is your garden going to be? In cities, a lot of times the gardens are very limited. And so you have to think about, well, is this certain plant going to take up a lot of space, and do I really want that plant? Or can I just go to the farmer's market and support a local farmer and get fresh vegetables down there, and I'll grow this instead and have more fun just growing that? So I'm thinking of something like a zucchini plant, which can take up 1 meter by 1 meter. And so that takes up a fair big amount of space. Whereas if you grew carrots in there, you'd only have 1 zucchini plant, but you might have like 50 or 60 carrot plants in that area. So you might want to put carrots in there instead, go down to the farmer's market and pick up some zucchini down there. So think about how much space you have. And also you might be thinking, well, I don't really have much garden space, but I want to try growing vegetables in pots. Well, that's perfectly okay, and any vegetable can be grown in a pot. The key is that you have to have the right size pot. So for example, here I've got 2 different size pots, and of course there's more sizes than this. But this size pot, this would be big enough for 1 potato plant or 1 tomato plant. Whereas this pot, or you could fill this all up with probably about 20 different carrot plants in here. Whereas this pot, you would not put a tomato or a potato in here. It's just not big enough to carry it through the whole year. So you might get a lettuce plant in here or 5 or 6 carrot plants. So you can grow in pots. The big thing if you're growing in pots is that you have to keep them watered really well and don't let them dry out. And they dry out quick, so it's pretty much a daily thing with watering these. It's a lot of commitment. Okay, the other thing is with your garden spot or your pots, you should think about you need a sunny location. Vegetables love sun, at least 6 to 8 hours a day, at least. And the other thing is if you have big trees in your yard, even though there might be a sunny spot, you have to remember those trees are sucking up a lot of water and a lot of nutrients from the soil. So it might be a challenge growing vegetables in your yard if you have big trees. So I would suggest putting in a raised bed, getting some wood. Make sure the wood isn't toxic. You don't want to use railway ties or something like that. It has to be something safe. And making a raised bed, lining it with plastic, put holes in the bottom so that the water can actually seep through the plastic. But about a 2-foot bed or so. And that way they're growing above ground, and if you keep it watered, the trees aren't sucking out all the moisture and all the nutrients. So that's another option if you have a lot of big beds in your yard, or growing with pots. So again, make sure you have a sunny location and make sure you have some access to water, to irrigation. You'll need to water your vegetables when it's in full season, like June, July, August, at least 1 inch per week. All right, so make sure that you have some good water to water. You don't water that much at the beginning when they're first coming up, but as it goes on, it's 1 inch a week. So again, before you get into your garden, plan your space. Think about, okay, what am I going to grow and how much space do they need? And the thing is, anytime that you buy a seed packet, it should say on the back of it, the space, how far apart you should plant the seed, how much space the plant needs. So think about your garden. If it's 10 meters by 10 meters and you're going to grow that one zucchini plant, okay, well that's 1 meter gone, 1 meter by 1 meter. Then you're going to grow some potato plants. They're usually about 30 centimeters apart or a foot. So in a square meter, you could maybe get like 5 or 6 potato plants. And so actually draw it on a paper and figure out where you're going to put what in your garden and how much space it needs. Block it into sections. Once you have your space prepared and you know the space, you have to prepare your soil. And so to do that, if you have an area that was a garden already, but it's grown over with weeds or whatever, well, you just need to get that rotor-tilled or dug up. And don't go buy a rototiller if you're just a new gardener. There's lots of people out there that will come and rototill your garden for you in spring. Just look online, check the papers, check Google, and someone will come and rototill your garden for hopefully $50 or so, maybe even less, maybe a little bit more, and get it rototilled up. Or you can just spade it yourself and turn it over. Once you're an experienced gardener, you may have heard about things called no-till gardening. I don't want to mention that in this talk, but that's if you're an experienced gardener, you can look into that more. Okay, so your soil is ready. Also, if your soil doesn't look like there's a lot of organic matter and you're like, oh my gosh, organic matter, what is that? Well, that's if you pick up the soil and you see like maybe some leaves or some straw, there's something earthy about it. There's probably organic matter in there. But if you pick up soil and it just seems like sand, like there's nothing in there, there's no leaves, no trees, no leftover trees or anything, there's probably not much organic matter, and you should add some to your garden. It's a good idea to add some every year anyway. So get some compost, either well-rotted manure, or you can get compost from the city, or you can purchase some compost from a local distributor. Put about at least 2 to 3 inches of compost all over your garden before you rototill, and rototill that in. Compost is great for the garden. You should add it every year. So add some compost every year. But get it started and then rototill it, then your garden's ready. Okay, so you've got your garden rototilled. You did this in early May. You've got all your seeds. You're getting ready. You're excited. Usually I recommend planting around the May long weekend or slightly after. If you go before, you're going to run into some issues possibly with cold weather. And you have to remember, once these plants are up, if they get below 0 temperatures, they're going to freeze and die. And so you need to make sure that if there's a frost event coming, if the temperature is going to go below zero and your plants are up now, even if it's late May, early June, you have to get out there and cover them. And you can use something like a bed sheet or towels, whatever, just something to keep the heat in the ground. And you would go out there in the evening, cover it before it gets too cold, goes through the night, it'll freeze, but your plant should be okay. Then in the morning, once the sun is out and the temperatures are above zero again, you take your covers off. So that's how you protect from frost. And yeah, make sure that you plan for that and always watch the weather, because there's nothing worse than you plant your garden and it's all coming up and everybody's excited and we get this frost event beginning of June and everything's dead the next day and you're like, ugh, that's horrible. All right. So some general rules, again, I mentioned this before, but you'll be watering about 1 inch a week of water. And at first, when your plants are coming up, you won't be watering that much, just light waterings. Keep the garden weed free. As your plants are coming up, make sure you keep the weeds out. Weeds will not only take nutrients and water away from the plants, but they also will invite other insects which can spread diseases. So you want to keep weeds out. And if you're a brand new gardener, you might be going, well, I don't know what's a weed and what's not a weed. Like, I've planted this stuff and I don't even know what it looks like. Well, let's say you've put out some lettuce and you're like, I don't know what it looks like when it first comes up. Well, just go online, Google new lettuce plants and take a look and you'll see what the new plant looks like. And if you plant in rows, you should be able to see the row is coming up and you'll know those aren't the weeds, those are actually the lettuce plants. And anything outside that row, just pull it out. As the season goes, you might see plants that look diseased, like they look yellow or there's lots of bugs on them or something. Even if they're your vegetable plants, pull them out. Don't keep any diseased plants around because that'll just spread to other plants. Pull them out, put them in the garbage, bury them, burn them in your back fire pit, do whatever, but get them out of there. The other thing is if you see a lot of insects, take a look. You know what, identify the insect first because maybe they're beneficial insects and you might want to keep those around. But if they're bad insects, if they're harming the plant, you want to get rid of them. Sometimes it can be something as simple as spraying water on them to get rid of the insects. And sometimes you might want to use something a little bit heavier duty. But you can check with your local garden center. You can phone Garden Line at the University of Saskatchewan. But make sure you identify your insect before you go and kill it because you don't want to be killing good bugs. The other thing is around your garden, if you have grass around it, keep the grass cut, okay, well manicured. You don't want bugs coming from the grass into your garden. If you have lots of high plants and things growing around the garden, bugs tend to hang out there and then they'll go into your garden, so keep everything well manicured. Now, I'm going to go through a few of the vegetables that I think you should grow. And I'm going to start with things that you would plant earliest and you'd harvest earliest and go to later plants. So the first one of the things you could plant even earlier than the May long weekend, but let's just go with the May long weekend this time, are some radishes. And there's lots of different radishes out there. And like I said, go to your local garden center, see what they advertise. The other thing you could look at is North Dakota State University has vegetable trials, and if you Google North Dakota State University vegetable trials, it'll come up with what they recommend. We used to have trials here, but we don't do it here anymore at the university. But they'll give you recommendations for vegetables to grow at cooler temperatures at northern latitudes, so you can check that out. Anyway, I've grabbed this one here. It's called Easter Egg Blend. And these radishes are white and purple and pink and all different colors. So they're kind of cool to grow. Radishes, you seed them in the ground and they're ready after about 30 days. They're one of the first things that you can harvest. So as you can see here, I've got some soil. This is my field indoors. Okay, and what you would do, you open up the packet. And now it's good to notice, now, I'm going to put some gloves on. Some of these seeds are treated, and so you should never handle treated seeds with bare hands. And I had just had these handy, but I wish I had the disposable ones that are tighter to your hands. That's probably better. But these ones I can keep all the time, and I can wash them and reuse them, so it creates less garbage as well. So anyway, I've got some seeds here, and they're very small, and they're treated. So what I'm going to do is in your garden, you would take your garden and you just make a little line, okay? A little trench, I guess you would call it. The seed is pretty small, so you don't want to make it too deep. So I would say like 1/2 centimeter or so. And you're taking this seed, and remember you have a gloved hand, and it's not going to work with these gloves, so don't get these kind of gloves. Get gloves that are tighter to your hand. But anyway, and you'll just seed your radishes. We're seeding them, and actually you can do it like this because radishes can be pretty thick. Usually they say about 1 centimeter, but you can sprinkle them like this. Okay, you sprinkle them in your row, and then you just lightly cover them with your hands. All right? And you should have a stake to put in there. I'm just going to use this handy knife that I have right now. But you should have a little stake, and you should put stakes in your rows so that you know where you seeded until they come up, because you don't want to be in there digging around before they come up, and then all of a sudden you dug up all your seed. So you'll know where the seeds are supposed to germinate. Your next row would be you have to look at the spacings. So if you're doing another row of radishes, you'd only put them about 15 centimeters apart, 6 inches. Make another row and seed some more radishes. And then put another stake in there to mark the row. Okay? So radishes are one of the earliest things to grow. One of the issues you're going to have, though, is some root maggots. Can be a problem with radishes. Unfortunately, there's nothing you can spray. There's nothing to control them. It's because we have so many canola fields. Root maggots also go to canola, and so they attack radishes as well. So it's kind of hard to grow radishes, but it's an easy vegetable to grow, but we have insect issues with it. So you might as well give it a try. Okay, the other thing, though, with radishes I was going to mention is lots of times those root maggots that attack the radishes, they actually overwinter in the soil in the garden. So if you really love radishes and you want to grow radishes, just take a pot, fill it with some potting soil that you can buy at your local garden center, and grow your radishes in a pot with fresh media. And that way the root maggots, they won't be as apt to attack your radishes, and you should get radishes that aren't full of root maggots if you grow them in a pot with new soil every year instead of in the garden. So that's one way to get around it. Okay, the other early crop the next crop that you would grow that would be early to harvest would be spinach. And again, these seeds are very small, okay? And so very tiny. Again, you only put them down about a centimeter, about a centimeter. Make your row again like I showed you. And I just sprinkle. They always have these exact spacings for seeds, like they say, plant them 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters apart. I just sprinkle them roughly because lots of times not all the seeds come up. The other thing is something like spinach, you can actually pick it early, and so if your plants are too crowded, you just thin it out and eat it as it's coming up, and you can do that. So if you're closer spacings than what they recommend, don't freak out about it. You can always thin them out later. Okay, so that would be spinach. That's another, again, a small seed. One of the spinach varieties that I like is called Tyee, Tyee, and that's a good variety that I found. You can always do a second planting of spinach late in the season. Spinach doesn't like really hot weather, but if you plant early in spring and then, like I said, it's ready to harvest in 30 or 40 days, and then you can plant later in August, and you could harvest it in September. So you could have 2 plantings of spinach, and you can get it twice during the year. All right. Now, the next thing that you would probably be harvesting after your spinach is lettuce. Okay, and there are different types of lettuce. Of course, everyone knows about the head lettuce that you can buy in the store. Well, guess what? Head lettuce doesn't grow very well in Saskatchewan. It's too hot. And there's a picture here showing of head lettuce that has been diseased and is dropping. This was a lettuce that I was growing in the field. Didn't work very well. We didn't get anything to eat. So I don't recommend growing head lettuce. I would grow either romaine lettuce, or sometimes it's called cos, C-O-S, or leaf lettuce, either one of those. And I've got a little leaf lettuce here. Sometimes leaf lettuce can be green, reddish green. Yeah, they're all good. Again, this is very small seed, and it doesn't get planted very deep. In fact, the seed is even smaller than than the spinach seed. And so again, you just make your row and you sprinkle it out. And again, don't worry about the exact spacing. Just lightly sprinkle it, you know, make sure you keep it in the row, and then cover it up and pat it down, okay? Lettuce is usually ready to harvest about 60 days after you plant it, so usually in early to mid-July. Sometimes too, just to remember, if it's been really hot out, if we've had some really hot weather, lettuce can sometimes be bitter tasting. So that's often what gives the lettuce the bitter flavor. If you eat your garden lettuce and you're like, ugh, that was horrible. Well, it might have been due to the weather. The other thing is sometimes some varieties of lettuce are more bitter than others. So if you don't like what you planted, try a different kind next year. Okay, the next vegetable that I would recommend that's pretty easy to grow are carrots. And carrots, there's 3 types of carrots. So you can see on this slide here, it shows there's imperator, which are like long and tapered. And those are the kind that you find a lot in the grocery store. And then there's also something called Danvers, which are short and tapered. And then Nantes are a type that are more cylindrical and they have a rounded tip. You don't find Nantes carrots in the store very much, although you are finding them more recently from local growers, so vegetable growers here in the province. The thing is, the Nantes are my favorite carrot. They're the juiciest. And so because they're so juicy, they don't ship very well. So when they're shipping carrots from California or wherever they're shipping them from, they would break a lot if they shipped Nantes type. So that's why they ship this imperator type. And the imperators aren't as juicy. And that's why sometimes the carrots we get in the store are not nearly as good as the garden carrots. So if you're growing carrots in your garden, I recommend growing a Nantes type. And you're like, oh. Anyway, Nantes is Nantes. But you won't find that where it says Nantes. What you're looking for is a variety, something called like Yaya, Y-A-Y-A. That's actually a Nantes carrot. And Bolero, I know that's one you can get locally, the seed for. And so, yeah, look for something like that. And the interesting thing is, too, carrot seed, the key with carrot seed when you're planting it, I have a lot of gardeners who say, my carrots didn't come up, and I hear it year after year. And the big thing is that carrots need moisture when they're germinating, and they need consistent moisture. So if you can see these seeds, they're white in color. Carrot seed is actually small, but these are coated in clay. And so the idea of putting a clay material around the carrot seed is that it actually attracts water. And so the seed will stay wet longer. And so that's why sometimes carrot seed, you'll see it coated with this clay material. So one thing with carrots, again, you just make your shallow trench here. And then, again, you know, you got the spacing issues, but you can always plant them thicker than what they say, and you can thin them out during the season. You can pick carrots as soon as the root is the size that you want to eat. You don't have to wait till the end of the season. I start picking carrots as soon as I see a carrot like that big and that round. And I plant them thicker usually because then I can thin them out. And at the end of the season, the carrots are bigger. So ideally, you can start picking your carrots probably end of July and then just keep picking them right to the end of September until we get a heavy frost. So anyway, I've seeded those carrots. I've put them down. And now this is one vegetable that you definitely want to water in. And I water in all my seeds, but the carrots, it's really important. And so either you have a misting hose or something with a nice nozzle, or you can just take a watering can and you just lightly water them in, okay? And like I said, it's good to do this with all your seeds, but especially with carrot seeds because they don't like to dry out. And so you should water your carrot seeds and even your little seedlings as they come up almost every day or second day. And if you have a soil that is heavier and tends to get a crust on it, for sure keep watering, because if you get a hard crust on your garden soil, the carrot seedlings are so tender they won't even pop out of the ground. So that's the key with getting carrots to grow. Once they're growing and they're like, you know, a couple centimeters long, they'll keep growing, but it's just getting them out of the ground initially that can be an issue. Okay, so carrots. Then you should, if for new gardeners, definitely grow some peas. These are always fun. And pea seed, it's a little bit bigger than the seed that we've been talking about. And again, here we have, this is a treated seed, and I don't, my fancy gloves there. But anyway, you can see on this trowel, that's bigger seed. When it's pink in color like that, that means that it's probably been treated with something, and it should say it on the package. And again, you shouldn't be handling that with your bare hands, okay? Definitely don't, so wear some gloves, put it in the soil. You can also buy untreated seed. So if you don't want any seed that's treated with chemicals, just ask at your garden center and say, you know what, I want untreated seed. And now most of the time, there is some seed that is untreated. The reason they treat it is that things like peas and beans and corn, lots of those seeds as they're germinating, if it's too wet and too cold, they'll start to rot in the ground. So that's why they started treating them with this fungicide. But you don't have to, if you're going to be more careful about your watering, and if you don't care if you lose a few to rotting, then just go with untreated seed. But like I said, never handle this with your bare hands. Okay, and the peas, because this seed is a little bit bigger, as you can see, that can go a little bit deeper. So this seed should go down about an inch or 2 centimeters, 2.5 centimeters. So the bigger the seed, the deeper it can go. And like other seeds, they like to be watered in, but they don't have to. It's not like the carrots where you have to constantly keep watering them. Okay, then we've got, the peas I forgot to mention. There are different types of peas. So there's peas that most of us are used to where you shell and you actually just take the peas out. Those are regular garden peas. And then there's snow peas, which are flat, and they don't fill out at all. So those are called snow peas. And then there's also something called sugar snap peas, and that's where you eat the shell and the pea. And so when you're buying your seed, just pay attention to what kind you bought, because the snow peas that stay flat, they're never going to fill out. And so if you got your peas on the vine and you're waiting for them to fill out and there's snow peas, they're not going to do that. So make sure you know what kind of peas you have. And if you're filling out a garden, or if you purchased a garden pea or a snap pea, don't let those peas get too big, because once the pods get really bumpy and hard, the peas are going to be terrible to eat. They're going to be starchy and gross. So don't let your peas get too big, the pods. They should be filled if they're not snow peas, but not hard and bumpy, just filled, okay? All right, on to beans. So beans are interesting. Beans are what we call a warm season crop, and they like to have warm soil temperatures. So definitely don't plant these early. Like I said, we're going with May long weekend. But if it's been cool weather into May and the soil's still kind of cool, I would leave the beans until even later in May. The soil temperature should be at least 15 degrees Celsius. So there's lots of different beans out there. There are yellow beans, there's green beans. You can even get purple potted beans. And the thing is, for a new vegetable gardener, I'm recommending that you're just growing bush beans, or what we call snap beans. We're not doing any dry beans at this point, just the ones that you eat fresh with the pods, okay? And again, these are fairly large seeds, kind of like the peas. And look at this, it's a green bean, but the seeds are white. Sometimes the seeds will be black. And so these are fairly big, and they should be planted at least 2 centimeters, if not 2.5 centimeters deep. And so you make your trench a little bit deeper. Okay, so quite a bit deeper. And you put your seeds in there. Now these, because they're bigger seeds, they're easier to space out. And so usually you want to put these about an inch or 2 inches apart. And like I said, make sure they're in there and they're covered really well. Okay, the deeper the seed, the deeper you can plant it. All right, beans are usually ready to harvest, about 60 to 80 days after you plant them, depends on the variety. And again, it's like, don't let the pods get hard or bumpy with your beans, because then they're going to taste horrible. They're going to be dry and bitter. So you want your pods to be on, you're actually eating immature beans. That's what these are. The seeds are immature. So you want them to be fresh, tasty, tender. And so don't let the pods get too big. And if the pods are too big and bumpy, you've probably let them go too far. Once your beans start producing, you can actually pick them probably every second day. There'll be pods to pick because they mature quite quickly. The other thing with bean harvest is don't harvest them if the plants are wet. Same with peas. If you're handling those plants when they're wet, there's certain diseases that tend to spread when the plants are wet. So try not to harvest them when the plants are wet. Do it later in the day when the plants are dry. Okay, potatoes. If you're a new vegetable gardener, definitely grow some potatoes. They're a lot of fun. They're pretty easy to grow. When you're buying seed, hopefully you get little seeds like this, and that's what you're planting in the ground. When you buy your seed, they might not all be that size. So you might get a bigger seed like this. And what happens with these seeds is that each little sprout or each little eye on the potato turns into a sprout. And so that will form a stem. And on the stems underground, that's where new potatoes are formed. And so when the potatoes, if they're bigger like this, you don't need to plant that whole potato. You can actually cut that into pieces. And so you would take this potato, and because there are some sprouts on top and some on the side and further down, I would cut this piece into at least 2 pieces. And make sure you have a sharp knife. This is not an ideal knife, but there we go. Okay, and so you've got there's only 1 sprout on here, but it's still going to grow. And so you can use that for a piece. Here we've got several sprouts yet, so I'm going to cut this up again. Okay, so this potato that we had, 1 potato, I've cut into 3 pieces. Now potatoes get planted fairly deep in the ground. So you want to dig down at least 6 inches, 15 centimeters. Put them in the ground. I always put the cut side down. I don't know if you have to. I don't think it matters. And these you would space at least a foot apart, 30 centimeters. Okay, so you put that in there. Now if you had these small seeds, you would just plant this whole small seed right down there. Okay, so we put them all down quite a ways and covered them up. And so you're waiting for them to sprout. Once they sprout and you see the tops coming, now what you need to do is you need to hill them. And in this slide you can see that you take a hoe like this. I even brought my hoe today. Okay, and you will hoe up the soil around where the potato has emerged. And so let's say this is my garden and my hands are my hoe. And you're going to hill just as that plant is emerging, and you cover it up the first time. Okay, so this is probably about a week, 2 weeks after. And you can cover that plant up, just leave a little piece of the plant out. And then in about 2 or 3 weeks, you would hill it again. And the whole idea of hilling or bringing soil around is that the plant actually produces potatoes under the soil. And so the more that you hill up around the stems, the more potatoes you're going to get under that plant. So remember, from 1 potato seed, we cut it into 3, and you can get 5 potatoes under each plant. And so you'd have 15 potatoes. You can harvest potatoes throughout the year, so you can actually reach in there about, I would say late July, beginning of August, reach under the ground. If you feel some potatoes under there and they're a size that you want to eat, you can actually rob a few potatoes from that plant, cover it up again, and the plant will keep growing and producing. Or you can dig up the whole plant and take some potatoes. Those potatoes you need to eat fresh. They won't store. But if you wait till the end of the season, until late in September, and you take the plant off, you let potatoes sit in the ground without the plant on top, so you pull your plant off, leave them there, and that kind of seals the skin. Those potatoes can be stored indoors for months, okay, under cool conditions, in your fridge or in a root cellar in the basement. All right, so those are potatoes. Fun to grow, you can get lots. Kids love digging around looking for potatoes, so that's a good one to grow. One other crop, now I'm going to mention corn because corn can be fairly easy to grow. Well, actually, it is pretty easy to grow. There's a few things that you have to keep in mind. The thing is, though, corn takes up a lot of space. And so if you're challenged for space, you might not want to grow corn. You might just want to go down to the farmer's market and get corn from a local farmer. But if you are going to grow corn, the thing to remember is that instead of putting it in a long row, you want to put corn in a block, in a square, because the plants actually pollinate each other. So if they're in a long row, you're not going to get very good pollination, and you'll get cobs that look like on the slide that you see right here. The cobs are not filled in very well, and so some kernels are missing, some are there, and that's probably what it is. It wasn't good pollination. So plant your corn in a block. The seeds, again, they're about, they get planted about 6 inches or 15 centimeters apart. And so if this was your little garden, your little corn block here, you'd probably get 3 by 3. You'd get 6 plants in here. Now each corn plant only produces about 3 cobs. So you'd get maybe 9 cobs out of this space. So corn takes up a lot of space. It also takes up a lot of nutrients and water. If your corn is looking yellow throughout the season, go down to your garden center, ask them for some nitrogen fertilizer, and you might need to add a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer or some extra compost in that area. So corn does take water and nutrients. But fresh corn is great to eat, is it not? Okay. Cucumbers are easy to grow. And again, they just need to be seeded. There are 3 different types of cucumbers you'll see on this slide. There are pickling types of cucumbers, which are small, and you pick them small and you make pickles out of them. There are slicing types, which are the longer slicer types that you see, and usually the skin in the garden is a little bit harder, a little tougher than what you would buy, say, of a slicing type cucumber in the grocery store where the skin is softer. They've grown it in the greenhouse, so it doesn't have to have such a tough skin. And then there's something called cocktail cucumbers, and those are like the medium size now where they have the soft skin. And that seed is out there too for the garden, so you can grow them like that. So cucumber seed, you just, again, plant it about a couple centimeters deep. They like to have good spacing. They grow as a vine, they spread out. Again, if you're stressed for space, you might want to put up a trellis, and you can see in this slide, the cucumber is trellised, and one cucumber is laying on the ground, so it depends how much space you have. And the cucumbers can hang if they're trellised, and you can pick them like that. Nothing special about cucumbers. If you're thinking, I'm seeing flowers, but I don't see any fruit, just relax. There are 2 different types of flowers on cucumbers, as there are in lots of crops. There's male flowers and female flowers, and if you look close at the flowers, underneath, if the flower is a little bit swollen, that's a female flower. The male flowers come out first, and they don't have those little swollen patches. And then the female flowers come out. So just watch for that. And also, because there are 2 different types of flowers, you need to have bees and insects to pollinate. So encourage insects and bees to be around your garden as well. Okay, one crop that I want to mention are tomatoes, because tomatoes are a lot of fun to grow, and everyone loves fresh tomatoes from the garden. The thing is, though, we don't seed tomatoes here in Saskatchewan. We don't have a long enough season, so you have to get a tomato transplant. And this slide shows a nice sized tomato transplant. They're usually about 6 to 8 centimeters long, nice root ball. So what you'll do, you'll have to go to your greenhouse and buy the transplants. Usually those transplants have been in the greenhouse, so you need to harden them off a bit. So you take them home, you set them outside for a couple hours the first day, bring them back in the house, the next day a few hours longer, the next day a few hours longer. So after about 3 or 4 days of being outside and there's no chance of frost, then you can plant your tomatoes in the garden. And what you want to do, you will have a trowel, and I actually have 2 trowels here. This is like a massive trowel. I can't believe it. We had this at work, and it was like, wow, who's using this? Some giant. And then this is a trowel this is more the size I would use. But if you have nice soft soil, this would be great. I would never use this in my garden. My soil's too hard. But if you have nice soft soil, look at how much soil this grabs. So that's a great trowel for that. But I'm using this one. So what you're doing with your tomato transplants, you're digging a hole, okay, and I don't have a transplant here because it's not the right season to be growing transplants, but you will take your transplant, set it in that hole. The root ball needs to be covered entirely. And the good thing about tomatoes is actually if you plant the roots and you cover part of the stem, roots actually grow out of the stem of the tomato. That doesn't happen with all plants. With tomatoes it does. So you put your plant in there and you just pack the soil around your tomato really well and give it some water. And ideally you want to give it a little bit of fertilizer. I recommend something that has the numbers 10, 52, 10, so a little bit higher in phosphorus. Ask them at the garden center. Say, I need some fertilizer with 10, 52, 10, and they'll give you this. And tell them you're transplanting tomatoes. And so then you just sprinkle that on. You only have to do that when you transplant it, and you'll have your tomatoes growing. The key thing about tomatoes through the season is that you want to be giving them adequate water and even watering. The thing is, if you let tomatoes dry out, you see the leaves are like wilting and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to water my tomatoes. So then you really water them. What usually happens, you can have problems with the fruit cracking, or sometimes you'll get this black patch on the bottom. It's called blossom end rot. And people will tell you, well, you don't have enough calcium. And you're like, no, that's not right. Jackie told me that I just didn't water evenly. Okay, so make sure you water evenly. You don't need calcium. There's lots of calcium in the soil. All right, so water your tomatoes evenly. Remember that. There's also, tomatoes are determinate and indeterminate, and you're like, oh, the language. But anyway, if you look at this slide, determinate means that they only grow to a certain size, they produce all their tomatoes, and then they die. And indeterminate, they just keep growing and growing, and they produce tomatoes like throughout the season. And if we had like a season that was a year long, you'd get so many tomatoes off of one plant. But in our growing season, because it's shorter, I recommend growing a tomato that's determinate. So when you're out at the garden, at the greenhouses, say, do you have determinate tomatoes? And I hope they know what you're talking about. They should know. Anyway, those usually ripen during our season a little bit better. So if you're a beginner grower, that's what I recommend, a determinate tomato. And on this slide, you'll see the difference between the determinates. The determinate tomato that I have on this slide, it's in a pot. That's like an extreme determinate tomato. It only gets about a foot high, and it produces those tomatoes, and then it's done, okay? But there are ones that get bigger and bushier. And the other thing is, if you have determinate tomatoes, you usually don't have to stake them, whereas if a tomato is indeterminate, it means it grows forever. You have to put a cage around them or stake them somehow. Otherwise, they go on the ground and the tomatoes tend to rot. And you might be wanting to grow a cherry tomato, and most of those are indeterminate, but they're a lot of fun to eat and they're really tasty. So just remember that if you're growing a cherry tomato, lots of times those plants get pretty big and you should probably stake them. Okay, oh, and the other thing with tomatoes, grow varieties that mature in 75 days or less. Okay, anything that's longer than that, you're probably not going to get many tomatoes in our growing season. The other thing that you should grow as a beginner gardener, and especially if you have children, is pumpkins. Definitely grow some pumpkins. That's always a lot of fun. I have a friend who grows his pumpkins actually just in the back alley because the vines can take up so much space. They do take up a lot of space, just to warn you. But he gets an area, probably only about as big as this, and puts one pumpkin seed, one plant, and then just lets the vines grow along the fence in the back alley. And so as long as you have your plant in the soil, the vines will grow on top of the soil. And you can get like giant pumpkins, like Atlantic giant pumpkins, or on this slide, you can see there's all kinds of pumpkins. Sugar pumpkins or pie pumpkins are usually smaller, and they're more for cooking. And then you get the jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, so lots of pumpkins out there. You just take the seed, and again, these get pretty big. Oh, and look at, this is cool. Look at how big these seeds are. Like, that's amazing. And so you take one seed and you just, well, I would put two because sometimes the seeds don't germinate. So I always put two down. But anyway, you want to put it in the ground, again, about 2 centimeters. Bury them nicely, pat them down, give them some water. And if both of those seeds come up, if you don't have a lot of area, I would pull one out. I know, don't cry, you hate to pull out plants. But if you have enough area for them to grow, you can leave the 2 seeds grow. But I always plant 2 seeds just to make sure at least I get 1 plant. Okay, so you can put that in the ground. Pumpkins grow throughout the season. They like lots of water. And you don't harvest your pumpkins until late in the season. And of course, once they turn orange, you can harvest them. But sometimes we get to the end of the season and it's going to freeze and your pumpkins are still green and you're like, oh, they're not going to be good. Well, what you can do, if we're just going to get a light frost, like say -1, you can leave your pumpkin fruit out there and the frost will kill the vines, but it won't actually damage the fruit if it's mature ready. And by mature ready, I mean it's going to survive that frost and it will ripen off the vine. If it didn't survive like a light frost, like -1, if you go out there the next day and it's all mushy, I'm sorry, but your pumpkin wasn't going to turn orange anyway. But anyway, if it's going to be a -3 or 4 frost, bring your pumpkins in because they won't survive that cold of frost. And at that point, even if they're green, bring them inside and put them in a nice warm location and they should ripen up. If they were what I call mature green, they will ripen up to orange if they're in a nice warm location. Put them in front of a sunny window and they'll start to turn orange. If they start to rot, I'm sorry, but again, they were never going to mature anyway. Just didn't have a long enough season. Okay, but we can grow pumpkins from seed here and they're lots of fun. The other thing, I don't have them with me, but strawberries, you might want to grow some strawberries. Those are fun too. You will buy the plants at the greenhouse, put them in like a transplant. There are 3 different types of strawberries. On this slide it shows there's June bearing, there's ever bearing, and there's something called day neutrals. I recommend growing something called a day neutral strawberry. A variety that's really common is Seascape, is what it's called. And the day neutral means that it will produce strawberries throughout the season, especially into the fall. The June bearing, as you might guess, produces berries in June. And usually you have to bring those through the winter and blah, blah, blah. We're not going there yet. You're a new gardener. Grow some day neutral strawberries. You should get some strawberries during the year. Seascape. Keep them watered. And if you want to try and bring them over to the next year, like to bring them through the winter, mulch them with some leaves or grass mulch or whatever you can find in the fall, and they might even pop up for you the next year, and you'll have strawberries for next year. And I also wanted to mention, grow some sunflowers, especially if you have kids. Get some sunflower seed, throw it in the ground, it grows up, they get tall. They're lots of fun. And some of them will actually produce sunflowers, and that will attract birds, and yeah, it can be a lot of fun. So I hope you have a lot of success with your garden. Oh, and one more thing to mention. I brought 2 hoes here today. So there are different hoes out there. This is called a beet hoe. This is just a regular hoe. I use a beet hoe for hoeing, for weeding. It's a lot finer, smaller blade. You can get in close to the plants, nice and sharp. So I would recommend using a hoe like this for actually weeding. This is the hoe, though, that you want to use when you're hilling your potatoes and doing things like that. So, yeah, that's what I would recommend. So I hope you have success with your garden. Good luck. It's going to be a great year. Don't forget to get your seeds. And if you have any questions, you can always phone the University of Saskatchewan Garden Line or go to your local garden center and ask them if you have some issues. Have fun. Happy gardening. See ya.